I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com.
Medical myths can be compelling. How can we tell the difference between fact and fiction? Should we follow the money? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Storytelling is a time-honored way to convey information. Drug companies have mastered the art of the very short story in the prescription drug commercials. Should we be skeptical?
You might think that debunking a medical myth would make it disappear. Au contraire, sometimes it simply reinforces the myth itself.
All the uncertainty about COVID-19 has allowed medical myths to flourish. Which ones are harmful?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, we talk with the author of Viral BS, Medical Myths, and Why We Fall for Them.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, the United States reached a grim milestone this week. The death toll from COVID-19 passed 400,000 people. More than 24 million cases of the coronavirus have been recorded since the pandemic began. In just the last 5 weeks, we have lost 100,000 people. The new head of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, has stated that there will be dark weeks ahead. She says that the CDC expects 500,000 deaths in this country by the middle of February.
The post-holiday surge has come at a time when COVID-19 is mutating in worrisome ways. The variant B.1.1.7 has spread widely in the UK and is responsible for the widespread outbreaks there. Hospitals have been overwhelmed, and the government has imposed tight lockdowns. Now, the highly contagious B.1.1.7 variant has been discovered in at least 19 states in the U.S. More than 50 countries have also identified this COVID strain. There's also another highly contagious variant, 501Y.V2, that has public health officials concerned. It's spreading in South Africa and Brazil. Even with travel restrictions, it's likely to reach other countries. Hopefully, the current vaccines will be effective against both of these variants.
There's growing concern that people may still be at substantial risk even after they seem to have recovered from the coronavirus. British researchers tracked nearly 48,000 COVID patients who were discharged from hospitals there. About 30% were readmitted over the next several weeks, and 12.3% died. People experienced serious breathing problems, heart attacks, heart failure, arrhythmias, strokes, diabetes, and chronic kidney disease. A similar study published in JAMA followed veterans diagnosed with COVID-19 who were discharged from 132 VA hospitals. Within 2 months of leaving the hospital, 27% of these patients were either readmitted or died. Post-COVID syndrome, as these complications have been termed, deserves more attention.
A small study published in the Lancet journal eClinical Medicine suggests that the inexpensive drug ivermectin might be helpful against COVID-19. Ivermectin was approved to treat parasites in animals in 1981. It was later found to be highly effective against onchocerciasis, also known as river blindness. It's improved the lives of millions of people in Africa. More recently, it's been found to kill head lice and the mites that cause scabies. Because ivermectin also has antiviral activity against the SARS-CoV-2 virus, some researchers began testing it against COVID-19. 24 COVID patients in Pamplona, Spain, were randomized to receive either ivermectin or placebo. Patients who received ivermectin had dramatically less viral load after 4 days. 7 days after treatment with the drug, the viral load was 18 times lower than in the placebo patients. The treated patients were half as likely to lose their sense of taste and smell and a third less likely to develop a cough. Larger clinical trials are called for before ivermectin becomes a key COVID treatment. The NIH Treatment Guidelines Panel has upgraded its ivermectin recommendation. Instead of warning against its use, as the panel did previously, they've changed to neither for nor against. As a result, ivermectin is in the same category as monoclonal antibodies. As more research becomes available, clinicians will be better able to gauge the effectiveness of ivermectin against COVID-19.
People all over the world love fried foods. French fries, falafel, fried chicken, fish and chips, and churros, to name just a few. A new study published in the journal Heart suggests, however, that fried foods are bad for our health. Researchers conducted a meta-analysis of 23 studies. According to the results, people who eat the most fried food have a 28% higher risk of major cardiovascular events. A diet laden with fried foods was associated with a greater likelihood of stroke and heart failure. Additional servings of fried foods increase the risk in a linear fashion. These results should have important implications for dietary guidelines. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. We're inundated with conflicting messages about health. Eggs are loaded with cholesterol and will clog our arteries. Eggs are good sources of protein and choline and will lower your risk of coronary artery disease. That's just one example of many contradictory and confusing health statements. Which ones are medical myths and which ones are true? And how will we know the difference?
Our guest is Dr. Seema Yasmin. She's a public health physician, director of the Stanford Health Communication Initiative, and clinical assistant professor of medicine at Stanford University. Her new book is titled Viral BS: Medical Myths and Why We Fall for Them.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Seema Yasmin.
Thanks so much for having me here.
Well, we're delighted that you're joining us today. Dr. Yasmin, Terry has been teaching me about a word. It's called epistemology. Did I get that right?
Close enough.
And what it means is, it's a big word. It's a $10 word. It's how do we know what we know? And it just fascinates me that it's much more complicated than most people think. So I guess the question for you today, why do humans have such a hard time being rational?
I love that question. I think about it a lot. I get frustrated by it a lot, not as like I'm the most rational person, but of course, in my work, I study not just the spread of disease, but the spread of misinformation and disinformation about disease. So very often I'm confronted with people, and usually groups of people, because of the way we are hardwired to be kind of tribalist and think like others around us think, confronted with these ideas that people might hold that go against the evidence. And we are constantly asking ourselves, well, how is knowledge created? How is knowledge acquired? And I think most importantly, at least to me, how might we actually shift a person's belief? If they have a deep-seated belief about vaccines, or now about wearing masks, or about doctors and medical care in general, what might enhance our chances of successfully shifting their mindset around a particular area? And certainly we can't go into that conversation or into those conversations assuming that we always think in a rational manner, because we just know, all of us, that we don't. Some of us are scared to fly, even though we know for a fact that statistically getting behind the steering wheel of your car is more dangerous. And yet we still harbor these beliefs, often with that insight that I know this doesn't make sense, but I'm just really scared of this one particular thing. And I think trying to grapple with that might be just grappling with the whole idea of what it means to be a human.
Well, certainly we have seen over the last not quite a year a fertile ground for a lot of misinformation and disinformation to flourish. Can you tell us about some of the medical myths that have been propagated about the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, and why did they get such traction?
Oh, we could spend days just talking about the different medical myths and health hoaxes that I've been tracking. There's everything from the virus itself. Was it engineered in a lab and kind of set loose as a bioweapon? Then there are the myths about how the virus that causes COVID-19 might spread. Everything from it spread through particular animals, which we haven't got evidence for that kind of transmission, to this belief that the virus is spread via the airways using 5G technology. And you might kind of be like, that sounds ridiculous. When has that ever happened? But if you think about the impact of that, we saw more than 70 cell phone towers set fire by arsonists in the UK in the spring of last year. Dozens also set on fire and destroyed in the US and around Europe too. Then there are the myths about the treatments for COVID-19. We heard so much spread about hydroxychloroquine, of course, ivermectin, all sorts of different medicines for which there really wasn't evidence that those could treat or prevent COVID-19. And now, of course, we have the many flourishing myths about the COVID-19 vaccines, either those that are already available or the experimental ones. I think what makes it fertile ground for these to spread, particularly now, because this isn't a new phenomenon. We've had this issue of health and science misinformation and disinformation for centuries, for as long as we've been around, probably. But it's the fact that people can really exploit the panic and the fear that exists at the moment. And also we're living in a world that is full of uncertainty at the best of times. But in the middle of a crisis, we are really trying to piece together crucial bits of information. Early on, we were still figuring out how does this spread? We were thinking about ways to treat it, ways to prevent it. And oftentimes when scientists are being really, really frank, as we should be, we're saying, I don't know. I'm sorry, we haven't got the answer to that yet. We will investigate. We are doing those studies now. But then you have people who come along who are not using evidence, not using a rigorous scientific process, who will say, I will speak with complete conviction and certainty. And this may be false, but you don't know that. And also to you, it just sounds like it's closing the circle. It's filling in the gaps.
What we hear a lot, Dr. Yasmin, is I saw someone on YouTube. As if, like, that's the ultimate authority. He was a doctor.
I think the interesting thing about that is frustrating. It's like, why? That's one data point from someone we don't even know who they are or what their data sources are. But it brings back the message, which is something that I teach a lot in science communication, is how powerful is it to have one human speaking almost directly to another human, telling an anecdote or telling a story. So often when I am teaching epidemiologists, for example, about effective communication skills with the public, I'm like, I'm an epidemiologist too, so I get it. We love millions of data points. We love huge data sets. For us, a singular data point could be an outlier. We're really wary of that. But actually, when it comes to building a connection with someone, forging that bridge and getting your story across, that format, the story, is way more compelling, believable, and memorable and entertaining than here are 1 million data points that show this evidence for this thing. That the numbers just go over people's heads. And I think we need to remember, yes, we love our evidence, but we also need to use evidence-based methods for getting the information across.
Now, Dr. Yasmin, are humans hardwired to really go for the story?
I am not a neuroscientist, so I'll be really careful in terms of talking about like synaptic connections or about hardwiring, but I do go by the evidence from folks who study communications. And what they have been doing in their field outside of science is looking at those of us who do science communication for a living. And some of them are saying to us, hey, y'all, like you use this method called the knowledge deficit model, which is saying, hey, there's a thing that you don't know, but I have that knowledge. So I'm going to translate it into the right kind of level for you. And I'm going to bridge that gap and ta-da, we're done. That knowledge deficit has now gone. You know a thing you didn't know. That's the tried and tested method for science communication. We've been doing it forever. We're still doing it now. The communication scholars say, yeah, that doesn't work. There are too many cognitive biases there. And so actually, you need to use narrative. Again, a word and storytelling that kind of puts a lot of scientists off. They say you need to use narrative techniques to get that information across. Otherwise, there's assimilation bias, confirmation bias, all sorts of biases that just get in the way of us assimilating new information.
I'd like to go back to a couple of the myths around COVID-19. And I can't tell you how many messages we've gotten from people who say masks don't work, they're useless. Doctors are forging death certificates to get extra money for their hospitals. I mean, that's illegal. Any doctor who did that would be susceptible to litigation, to criminal charges.
Yeah.
How do you think those messages continue to spread?
I think because there might be an iota of truth in there. So for sure, by and large, doctors are not forging death certificates. Doctors are not trying to overdiagnose people with COVID-19. But you know what? Doctors are receiving higher reimbursements for patients that have COVID-19. That's a fact. And thank goodness, because the cost of caring for COVID-19 patients is really high. You need all sorts of protective measures. You need PPE. So Congress did pass an act last year in 2020 that meant that hospitals were being reimbursed at a higher rate for COVID-19 patients. So then you can see how that truthful element can snowball into, oh, they're making more money off COVID, they're overdiagnosing COVID, they're just faking the death certificates. So I think what I find really interesting anyway is kind of like going back and doing a root cause analysis, or kind of following the roots back to the origin story of people believe this thing. On the face of it, sounds absurd. We need to correct it. But before we just get really annoyed and are like, of course, doctors are not forging death certificates, let's think about why this myth might have persisted in the first place. And I think that can be really useful.
Dr. Yasmin, one of the coronavirus myths that breaks my heart is that young people don't get sick. Can you tell us about that?
This started off early in the pandemic with lower rates of infections and deaths amongst children and teens. Of course, by and large, overall, it's good news that younger folks do have lower infection rates and lower death rates compared to especially older adults. But that doesn't mean that all kids and all teens and all young people are somehow magically immune to the coronavirus. And it just shows how important it is to be accurate when we're doing science communication, that the rates might be lower. That doesn't mean that every child and teenager is safe from infection.
You're listening to Dr. Seema Yasmin. She's a public health physician, director of the Stanford Health Communication Initiative, and clinical assistant professor of medicine at Stanford University. She was previously a disease detective in the Epidemic Intelligence Service. Her new book is titled Viral BS: Medical Myths and Why We Fall for Them.
After the break, find out why you can't just make a myth disappear by debunking it.
Once people have accepted an idea like eggs raise cholesterol, it's hard to get them to change their minds. Another popular idea is that you need to drink 8-ounce glasses of water a day. Is that true?
Stories really are a powerful tool for learning. That's why doctors use case reports in medical education. They're kind of a story.
How can we use data to change people's ideas?
We'll find out how to unravel the knots of fact and fiction in the healthcare information we get.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy podcast is supported in part by CocoVia Memory Plus. CocoVia cocoflavanols support both cardiovascular health and cognitive function by promoting healthy blood flow, transporting oxygen and nutrients to vital organs and muscles, including your heart and brain.
CocoVia Memory Plus has 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that have been proven to help boost memory.
CocoVia Memory Plus is backed by 4 clinical trials that demonstrate improvement in 3 different aspects of memory: long-term memory, spatial memory, and word recall. The studies show improved brain function in just 8 weeks.
You can try the benefits of CocoVia Memory Plus with a 25% discount off your first month. Use the code PEOPLES25 To get the full benefits, take it daily for 8 weeks. CocoVia is offering People's Pharmacy podcast listeners a 10% discount on subscriptions. That code is PEOPLES10. Learn more at cocovia.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia Memory Plus, a cocoflavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verazana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome, now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
Where do you get your health information? Friends, family, the internet, cable TV, books, medical journals? There are so many sources that it can be difficult to sort out which ones are trustworthy and which ones are bogus. When you ask Dr. Google, you'll see paid ads and popular sites first. Just because something is considered mainstream, however, doesn't necessarily make it true.
Our guest is Dr. Seema Yasmin. She's a public health physician, director of the Stanford Health Communication Initiative, and clinical assistant professor of medicine at Stanford University. Her new book is titled Viral BS: Medical Myths and Why We Fall for Them.
Dr. Yasmin, a lot of people think, well, folks have got this wrong. All I need to do is just debunk the myth that's out there that isn't accurate. And yet, debunking doesn't work so well. Sometimes it just serves to reinforce the myth. Why is that, and how does that work?
Yeah, so we do have to be careful, as frustrated as we might be, and as much as we want to set the record straight, be careful about how we go about debunking myths. And in fact, the last chapter in my book is very deliberately called, Does Debunking a Myth Help It Spread? Because I kind of wanted to get into the weeds of that. There is a whole body of evidence that when you repeat a myth, even if it's to debunk it and dissect it, you can just be giving more oxygen and more of a platform to that misinformation or that disinformation. But then there's also a body of evidence that says, look, if you do it right, that can be really helpful to folks. You can be dissecting and debunking and protecting them from believing a falsehood. The thing that you want to be careful about is another kind of cognitive bias called the backfire effect. It's basically, there's a misconception that when your beliefs are challenged with data, with evidence, with facts, that you would think, alter your opinions and incorporate the new information into your thinking. What some social psychologists say to us, actually, when your deepest beliefs are challenged by evidence that contradicts it, your beliefs, the false ones, can actually get stronger. It's like you're digging in your heels and protecting your precious belief. Like, no, I just want this to be true. And so one of the ways that we learned about this was back in 2006. There were these 2 political scientists, Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler, and they did this experiment where they gave the people in their experiment a newspaper article to read, and it was a false one, and it claimed that weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. Then they took that away and they gave the folks in their experiment another article, and it said, what you just read was false. No weapons of mass destruction were found. And what the political scientists found were that people were like, no, I don't want to be corrected. I'm going to believe the first thing that I read. And they said, no, but we just told you it wasn't true. And so the kind of like, in a nutshell, takeaway from that is that it seems to be easier to fool humans than it is to convince them that they have been fooled. So as we are trying to let people know, hey, and I know you've been told that masks mean you're breathing in carbon dioxide a lot more and it's really dangerous, but that's not true. Depending on how that conversation goes, it could backfire, and that person could just be like, no, you are wrong, and I really, really, really now believe that masks are dangerous. That's one of the things that we look out for.
Well, that's a great example, but there are so many in medicine that I've almost lost count. But let's just take a few. For decades, people were told eggs cause high cholesterol and heart attacks. So cut back on eggs, maybe 1 or 2 a week, but no more than that. And then along came some data to suggest, no, that's really not true. That's a myth. Then there was the other one. Oh, margarine is good for you. Butter's bad. And, it's very hard to change people's attitudes when it comes to food issues.
Yeah. And I think part of that conversation has to be peeling back the curtain on the scientific process and inviting the public in to understand, going back to your epistemology, how is knowledge created and how is it communicated and how is it shared? Because I think otherwise, everything that comes out of the scientific establishment is treated like a holy grail, as if it's fixed knowledge. And actually what we're trying to say is, science is not a tome. It's not a bunch of static facts. It's a process, right? It's an inquisitive process. You're asking questions. You're doing experiments. You're testing your hypotheses. And guess what? You can change your mind based on new data that comes along. And this became so apparent to me in the spring of 2020 when Dr. Fauci was really attacked for having said 1 month that we don't need everyone to wear a mask, and then saying the next month, we want Americans to make cloth masks at home or wear a surgical mask. And people were saying, oh, look, this just shows scientists don't know what they're talking about. And actually, Dr. Fauci was illustrating the whole scientific process, which is I may say one thing 1 month based on the best available data then, but you show me new evidence the next month and I will change my mind. And I think that building that scientific literacy is so important because otherwise you end up where we are now in the global health crisis, where you're not just teaching people about a new virus, but playing catch up to teach folks how science works.
Well, I like the idea that you mentioned that people often reject science. And so let's take a belief, and you may disagree with this, but there was and is, I think, a common belief that you absolutely must drink 8 ounces of water 8 times a day. Big glass of water, because otherwise you'll become dehydrated. And I've seen some studies that suggest, there's no magic number of glasses of water that you have to drink a day. And you can just wait till you're thirsty. Now, that's not necessarily true for really older people who are very sick, but there is this belief now that has penetrated a lot of people's consciousness that they just have to drink a lot of water every day to be healthy.
Yeah. And especially coming back to that 8 glasses a day, how might that be true for someone who weighs 110 pounds and has functioning kidneys versus someone who weighs 290 pounds and has renal failure? Like, it's going to be different for different people. On the other hand, if we're looking at this from a science communication perspective and like a health advocacy perspective, we're also balancing the idea of, are we doing a good by just kind of indicating that drinking water is important? And are we offering a kind of catchy, memorable, helpful kind of guideline for the majority in terms of how hydrated they should be? So I think all of those things factor into those conversations when we're thinking about how do we best guide a public that is massively diverse.
Dr. Yasmin, I think the idea that science is a moving target, that we're going to be changing our minds on things, is a little challenging for people to accept sometimes. And I'd like to ask you to illustrate it with one of the examples that we found in your book, Viral BS. You talk about MSG and Chinese restaurant syndrome. Can you tell us what the idea was here and why we maybe need more data to figure out if it's a problem or not?
So this has been widely debunked now, but if, like me, you grew up in the 90s, you will remember this idea that MSG, monosodium glutamate, was an additive put into food that was really dangerous. And in fact, there were some Chinese restaurants that would start putting up signs with MSG in a big red line through it, as if to say, we are good, we don't have that here. At the time when all of this was happening and these ideas were spreading, there were some case reports in the literature, in the British Medical Journal and other places, saying they talked about Chinese Chinese restaurant syndrome, that people were eating in Chinese restaurants. The people writing the reports were assuming that because of MSG, these people were then experiencing like palpitations and a flushed face and all these other kinds of symptoms. And it turns out actually it was really xenophobia. It was ingrained in the American consciousness that Asian food and Chinese food, there's something strange and mysterious and possibly dangerous about it. And it's this MSG that's to blame. And it turns out that it wasn't the monosodium glutamate doing any of that. But how pervasive is it when you have quote unquote evidence as case reports in the medical literature, and this idea that just spreads and is very established and people are buying it, that Chinese restaurant syndrome is actually a thing. And it turns out that you need to avoid monosodium glutamate as much as you need to avoid sodium in general. But in and of itself, it did not cause those symptoms that people were saying it did.
Now, aren't case reports another form of story or narrative?
That's a really good point. And in the book, I do have like the hierarchy of evidence that we talk about, like so at the pinnacle and at the base, like what is how do you rank different kinds of evidence? And yeah, case reports are way down there because they are literally, much more anecdotal, but it still goes to show how that might be interpreted versus another kind of story, a kind of story that's not printed in the British Medical Journal, that doesn't have MD after the author's names. And so we have to be really diligent, really careful in terms of how we analyze data and what we put out there, because it can spread far and wide.
Dr. Yasmin, the pharmaceutical industry has mastered the art of storytelling. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say that is because we have seen commercials, it's almost nonstop these days on television, that tell a story. It may only be 15 seconds, but you basically see people smiling and having fun. They're kids. There are dogs. I mean, even if it's a really serious health condition like breast cancer, recurrent breast cancer, mm-hmm. there are drugs that are going to make your life better. And then they talk about the side effects, and some of those side effects have horrifying complications, but that's told in a completely different way. And in fact, sometimes as they're describing kidney failure, heart attacks, and death, people are smiling and still having a really great time. Yeah. And there's a dog distracting your attention. So the drug companies have figured out, hey, if we tell a good story, we can trump all those scary side effects.
Absolutely. And I was born and raised in England. I've only lived in America for 10 years. And in England, we're not allowed to have that kind of direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising. And so we didn't grow up with those adverts that you see on American TV, where, as you say, it's the dog that's frolicking and a person smiling on the beach. And then suddenly at the end, there's like 10 seconds of all these side effects and may cause death. And you're like, wait, what? So when I first moved to America, I was like, what is this? This is like an onslaught, and it's so scary. But it shows that they do understand the power of storytelling. And I get frustrated because I'm like, in public health and in medicine, I'm trained as a doctor and I'm trained in evidence-based medicine. We don't do things without evidence. So why then do we not practice evidence-based communication? Because there is evidence out there. It's not from our field. We're going to have to read other journals like I do from communication scholars that show what works and doesn't work when conveying information. And the drug companies are showing you, and they are throwing tens of millions of dollars behind storytelling because they know that captivates humans. They know that that woman smiling in the depression advert for, the antidepressant, you're going to remember that. You're not going to remember the case report or the bullet points. And I get annoyed, for example, a couple of years ago, I got annoyed with the World Health Organization's Europe office because they tweeted something like, really bad measles outbreak happening in Eastern Europe right now, worst measles outbreak in decades, but we are disseminating pamphlets. And I was like, really? Like, we're disseminating bullet points in pamphlets? The things that are sparking these anti-vaccine movements are YouTube videos of a mom crying and convincing others that her child developed autism from the MMR vaccine. That's not true. That can't happen. But you know what's memorable? The mother crying in the video. And you know what's quite forgettable? It's your pamphlets with the bullet points. So we need to do better.
Well, Dr. Yasmin, how can we as consumers unravel the knots of fact and fiction in the healthcare information that we are receiving?
So I do include a BS detection kit in the back of the book that kind of just nails it down in terms of a few steps. And I think one of the key things that I think about in terms of a red flag is when something appears to be too good to be true or very novel in that you haven't seen it elsewhere. So I don't know if folks remember, but about 2 years ago in 2018, there was a big research study that came out of MIT. And the scientists there produced this data that found false information travels faster and farther than the truth. And it generated a ton of headlines because it's quite scary, right? You're like, oh, do we just give up now? Do we even stand a chance against social media and the fact that falsehoods seem to just go viral much more than accurate information? But I think to me, what was the most interesting thing about those studies were why? Why does false information travel faster and farther than the truth? Because if we can reverse engineer it, then we start to see what those red flags are. And a couple of those red flags one was novelty. Something can spread really far and wide when people who are receiving it are like, oh, haven't seen this elsewhere. I'm going to share it with others because I'll be the one sharing something new. And there was also this status points that you get for sharing something that is novel. So I think if you just remember that as a red flag, pause, do your due diligence before you retweet, share, believe something, and just think about, does this seem credible? Are other outlets reporting this too? Or is this isolated and does it just sound too good to be true or too new?
Well, Dr. Yasmin, one of the myths that you address in your book, Viral BS, is number 31. Does talcum powder cause ovarian cancer? So can you tell us about that? Because there's been some recent information on that.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting one and quite a disturbing one in terms of the fact that when we look at the evidence from the companies that produce talcum powder, it seems like they knew a long time ago that their product could be associated with increased risk of cancer. And it's not necessarily the talcum powder itself, it's the fact that the places where talcum powder is mined from, asbestos can be naturally occurring there as well. And so when that ends up in the product, it does enhance the chances of a person developing different kinds of cancer. And what we've seen is a generation of girls and women grow up putting talcum powder in their underwear. So it's going to the really intimate parts and exposed to mucous membranes where it then tracks up. And so there are associations between the use of that talcum powder and some kinds of, I would say, genitourinary cancers in women especially. But I think, again, the most disturbing things that have come out of these huge investigations looking into this is the fact that these companies had an inkling that there could be this danger a long time ago and didn't say anything. So that's another way that you erode trust in institutions.
You're listening to Dr. Seema Yasmin. She's a public health physician, director of the Stanford Health Communication Initiative, and clinical assistant professor of medicine at Stanford University. She was previously a disease detective in the Epidemic Intelligence Service. Her new book is titled Viral BS, Medical Myths and Why We Fall for Them.
After the break, we'll get some tips on how to understand medical journal reports. Do you really understand the difference between relative risk and absolute risk?
Dr. Yasmin will also share some favorite ideas from her BS detection kit.
When you watch television, do the prescription drug commercials seem compelling to you, or do you get aggravated like I do?
I like to listen to the words without watching the video. That way, I don't get distracted by a cute dog or a child or lulled by all the smiles.
Journalists are always supposed to follow the money. When we can do that, it can be very instructive.
Find out when you might need a second opinion.
We'll get a better handle on figuring out how we know what we think we know.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is brought to you by Verizana Health Club. This comprehensive home testing service enables you to track crucial health markers of gut health, inflammation, metabolism, hormones, thyroid function, and many other organ systems. Regular testing can help detect health imbalances before they lead to illness. Online at Verizana.com. That's verisana.com/health-club. Get 50% off the first month with the discount code PEOPLE50. That's PEOPLE 50. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Cocoa Via Memory Plus, a supplement with 750 milligrams of cocoa flavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that help support memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome, now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
Today, we are learning why we fall for medical myths. There have been so many conflicting messages about COVID-19, it's hardly any wonder that people are confused. How can you sort out helpful information from misleading reports? Being able to interpret statistics from medical journals could be really helpful. Should you be asking your doctor about the absolute risk reduction of the medicine she's prescribing?
We're talking today with Dr. Seema Yasmin. She's a public health physician, director of the Stanford Health Communication Initiative, and clinical assistant professor of medicine at Stanford University. Her new book is titled Viral BS: Medical Myths and Why We Fall for Them.
Dr. Yasmin, we talk a lot on the People's Pharmacy about the difference between absolute risk and relative risk. And this is something that's very confusing to people because they will often see a commercial on television or in a magazine, and it says drug X reduces the risk of heart attacks by 36%. And most people go, wow, that sounds great. Sign me up. And of course, I'm referring to statins now, and in particular, atorvastatin, Lipitor, because they're the company that had the commercial, the ad. And then if you actually look at the absolute risk reduction rather than the relative risk reduction, you discover that after 5 years in high-risk people, 1 person out of 100 could avoid a heart attack. And if you go, well, 99 people would have to take this drug so that 1 person could avoid a heart attack. How does that sound versus 36%? And as you know, it's a world of difference. So can you explain how sometimes even drug companies can, in a sense, tell the truth, but mislead people at the same time?
I am so glad that this is a topic that you all talk about a lot, because I think actually it's not that complicated and people deserve to know the difference because, as you say, it can just be so misleading. So let's just do like a quick example. Say you're told there's a new drug for the heart and it reduces the risk of you having a heart attack by 50%. And that might be what the headline says or the lead of the newspaper article. And you're like, whoa, I am making an appointment right now telling my primary care doc tomorrow, you need to give me this because I want a 50% lower chance of having a heart attack. The thing is, what's been included in the news reports, and it's so often included in the news reports, is the relative risk. Actually, if you look at the absolute risk, your actual chance of having a heart attack anyway might be 2%. And therefore, taking that new wonder drug would reduce your chance of having a heart attack from 2% to 1%. So the absolute risk is telling you your realistic chance of something happening to you. Of course, a reduction of having a heart attack from 2% to 1%, it is a 50% risk. But when you're told it like that, the numbers sound huge and they are misleading. So when I was a reporter at the Dallas Morning News, I used to write this column called Debunked, where I would respond to readers' questions about health and about science. And actually those columns ended up becoming this book. But that would really frustrate me that so often my readers were just misled because they were given the relative risk instead of the absolute risk. So what I started doing was contacting other science journalists or other journalists in general and saying, hey, I saw this piece you wrote. Why didn't you include the absolute risk? I think it would have been helpful. And folks were like, oh, there wasn't enough space in the article. My editor took it out, all these reasons. And I just think that's not good enough. Let people fully understand the extent to which their risk really has been reduced. And I think absolute risk is the one that gives you a better idea of that.
We totally agree. And it drives me nuts when the article published in the medical journal gives you a hazard ratio or an odds ratio instead of absolute risk. It just, because sometimes they just don't even offer that absolute risk information. And it's very frustrating.
Or you have to really dig hard to find it, because a lot of times, I hate to say this, the medical researchers may have gotten a very substantial grant from the pharmaceutical company that is trying to promote their drug. And boy, let's face it, 50% sounds great. 1%, not so much.
Which brings us to the question of how can we figure out what to believe and what we should perhaps not trust right away. And you have offered in your book a BS detection kit that will be very helpful. Can you walk us through some of the steps that we should all be taking, please?
For sure. And I've laid it out in 12 different steps, but there's a ton of ways to kind of go through this. As I just mentioned earlier, one of the first things to do, like before you retweet or before you just believe a thing, is take a second. And in fact, I was involved with a United Nations campaign last year that was all about this. It was called Pledge to Pause, because just taking that moment to do your due diligence can be really effective and really helpful in terms of stopping this, or limiting at least, the spread of misinformation. So one of the things I talk about in the BS detection kit is just take a quick look at who is making the claim. Do they have something to gain from spreading this particular information? Will they benefit from it? And have they been reliable in the past? If there are images in what you are seeing, it honestly does not take long nowadays to do a reverse image search on the internet. And that will kind of help you out a lot, because especially with COVID-19, we've been seeing all sorts of these images of here's a mass grave in Nicaragua and here's this thing, these protests, anti-mask protests happening elsewhere. And you do the reverse image searches and find that these are years old. They have nothing to do with the pandemic, and people just aren't doing their due diligence. You can also look to see if it aligns with your sense of common sense. Like, does what you're seeing appear to be credible? Like I talked about earlier, things that are novel, things that are new, that haven't been shared very much, tend to go viral because of that novelty factor. So use that as one of your red flags as well. This is something that's important for scientists, but for the general public too, is don't get overly attached to one particular hypothesis. Keep an open mind. You want to be a healthy skeptic and you want to consider alternative theories. And then also check in with your personal beliefs. Are you kind of going with something because it lines up with your worldview? That can be tricky because we have these baked in biases, but we can become more aware of them and therefore start to challenge our own beliefs a bit more. So there's more in the book, but those are some of the tips that I do give to people frequently.
Here's another one that many people are familiar with, but it's not always easy to do. Follow the money.
Yeah, every investigative journalist's favorite mantra, I would say. And in fact, we talked earlier about Andrew Wakefield and that fraudulent MMR vaccine data that he published. It was an amazing investigative journalist called John Deere, I think, in the UK, who followed the money trail. And it was really him that kind of brought to light for the rest of us how fraudulent this data was. And it was John Deere who figured out that there was a link between Andrew Wakefield, the doctor who was doing these studies, and he had the stocks in those vaccine companies making the individual, not the combined vaccine. So following the money trail can lead you to all sorts of interesting places.
Dr. Yasmin, sometimes following the money can also apply to mainstream medicine. And I'm thinking about angioplasty. I mean, this is a very expensive and very valuable medical procedure for people who are having heart attacks. But if you dial back about 10 or 15 years, there were a lot of interventional cardiologists who they would show a patient their angiogram and they'd say, "Oh, you're a heart attack waiting to happen. You have 40% blockage in that coronary artery. You need angioplasty. You need a stent now." And now we know that a lot of those stents didn't need to be placed, and that medical treatment with medications might do just as well. Or then there's the whole issue of knee arthroscopy and some back surgeries. So how do patients determine what they should or shouldn't do? How do they get a informed, objective second opinion? Because a lot of times patients want to ask their doctor, "Well, doctor, what would you do in my situation?" Well, unfortunately, if the doctor was going to make a pretty substantial profit from doing that particular procedure, it might not be objective.
Yeah, and it does depend also which healthcare system you exist within, which you're operating within. Because, for example, I did my medical training in the UK and worked in England. And so I kind of lived within the ecosystem of the National Health Service. And actually getting a second opinion wasn't a usual practice within the NHS, within the UK system. It's much more a thing that I've come to know about from living in the US. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I think we know in medicine that overdiagnosis and overtreatment is an issue. Certainly, I do think it's a big issue. There have been books written about this, and there's a lot of literature about the amount of overdiagnosis and overtreatment that occurs, particularly in the US. And I think getting a second, perhaps even if it feels appropriate and is possible, a third opinion is one way to counter that, to see how different experts' opinions line up with each other. And I think that's another way of doing your due diligence and checking whether a particular intervention is right for you or not, and finding out what the alternatives might be.
Well, as you point out, in the National Health Service, I don't think doctors actually make money doing things. They get paid a pretty straight salary, whereas in the U.S., a lot of healthcare providers actually, the more they do, the more they make.
That's
especially
correct.
If they're complex interventions.
That's correct. So within the National Health Service, there wasn't an incentive program in that way that would favor a particular doctor or encourage a doctor to behave in a particular way. That's true.
Dr. Yasmin, in your book, Viral BS, you offer a lot of different possible myths that may need some debunking. And one of the ones that you describe is drinking diet soda linked to Alzheimer's disease and stroke. Well, is it?
So actually, there's no proof that drinking diet soda causes Alzheimer's or strokes or other types of dementia, but that's exactly what some news outlets reported. And so folks were like, wait, should I give up my diet colas or my diet whatever? The thing is, there are some studies that show people who drink diet soda have a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. But what's not often explained enough is that that could be for many other reasons. So, for example, those people who are drinking diet sodas and who are shown to have a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease, well, maybe they're drinking diet sodas in the first place because they already have risk factors for stroke, for dementias. And so they're trying to avoid sugar and they're turning to artificial sweeteners. So then when you start looking into those factors and how the clinical or the studies are conducted, you start to see how you end up with a headline that says diet soda causes Alzheimer's, when the study itself was not the kind of study that could prove causation anyway. It could prove correlation, but even there are confounding factors.
Well, I'm glad you said confounding factors, because that was the term that was running through my head. It really does get to this issue of how do we know what we know? Because there are so many studies that show that two things are linked, but they don't show that they cause each other.
Yeah, and I think you can totally go so far with this that you're like, right, that's it. I'm going to seek the limitations and the flaws in every study and just not believe anything. And of course, that's not helpful either, right? If your doctor's told you need to take aspirin, you probably do. You should take it. At some point, we basically decide there's a consensus of knowledge. There's an acceptance that a particular thing is linked to an outcome, that maybe one thing causes another. But certainly, when someone is talking, that whole saying about correlation is not causation, when someone is talking about causation, you want to go back to that study to see, was it even the kind of study that could show causation, or was it more a study that can just point you to an association between two things?
And for a study that could show causation, you would need something on the order of a randomized controlled trial that was large enough and long enough?
Absolutely, and statistically powered to give you that information, yeah.
As long as we remember that consensus is helpful, but it could change. Joe mentioned earlier the idea that eggs could raise your cholesterol and cause heart attacks. That was consensus for a long time. Turned out that with more information, we had to abandon it. Can you give our listeners some idea of what we should take forward as general guidelines in looking for trustworthy healthcare information?
So I think to be healthy skeptics and, as much as possible, empower ourselves with the tool to do some of that basic analysis of just fact checking when it comes to news reports about a new heart wonder drug, for example. And then, of course, there are places you can go to that have undergone political pressure in the last year, but I think that will change. And I'm thinking about agencies like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and like the Food and Drug Administration, where generally, the science is rigorous. The guidelines that are produced are based on good evidence. And I think those are good starting points for really figuring out what data is strong enough to point to a particular behavior. And those are quite trustworthy in general.
Dr. Seema Yasmin, we really appreciate you talking with us today on the People's Pharmacy.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Seema Yasmin. She's a public health physician, director of the Stanford Health Communication Initiative, and clinical assistant professor of medicine at Stanford University. She was previously a disease detective in the Epidemic Intelligence Service. She's written 3 books, with the latest one titled Viral BS, Medical Myths and Why We Fall for Them.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
The People's Pharmacy is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
And by CocoVia, offering plant-based nutrients in the form of cocoflavanols for brain and heart health. Online at cocovia.com.
If you'd like to purchase a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy episode, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1243. The number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit the website, you can share your thoughts about today's show. Where do you find the most helpful health information? Are you concerned that the guideline committees that establish recommendations for treatment are often composed of health professionals who may have conflicts of interest?
If you'd like to follow the money and find out whether a doctor is receiving money from a pharmaceutical company, you can use a government database. Look for openpaymentsdata.cms.gov. You'll find a link to it on our website.
You can subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. We post the show on our website every Monday morning.
At our website, you can also sign up for our free online newsletter. Get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.